Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the On Centerline podcast. Now streaming on all major podcast providers as well as YouTube. So no matter where you're joining me today, thank you for joining me. I'm Sam Terrell, the Northwest Aeronaut on YouTube. And we are diving into our Instrument Pilot ACS breakdown. We did the private pilot ACS breakdown, and it was a huge hit. A lot of you have told me how much it's helped you pass your check rides and prepare for your orals, and that means so much to me. So thank you for reaching out and let me know, and I'm so glad that it's been helpful for you. So as a result, many of you have requested this Instrument Pilot ACS breakdown, and so that's what we're doing. We've done 2 episodes so far. We did the pilot qualifications and we did weather. And today we're going to be jumping into instrument cross-country flight planning. All right, so we've got a lot to cover here. We're going to jump right into it. Hey, before we do though, please, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button here on YouTube. Also, if you're listening on a podcast provider, please follow the show. It really helps the channel grow and means a lot to me. So thank you if you can do that. Jumping into cross-country flight planning for instrument flying. The objective here, not much different than it was for the private pilot. It is to determine the applicant exhibits satisfactory knowledge, risk management, and skills associated with planning an IFR cross-country and filing an IFR flight plan. All right, that's your objective for this section. We've got notes. It says preparation, presentation, and explanation of a computer-generated flight plan is an acceptable option. All right, so with these new ACSs, they're making it very clear that it is acceptable to use electronics to do this flight plan. It does not have to be all on paper. I make my private pilots do flight planning on paper when they're first learning and doing a paper navlog. Doing it over with instrument stuff and getting instrument charts these days is not as easy as it used to be and can be quite cumbersome. So I have no problem certainly doing IFR flight planning on ForeFlight here or any other program you might use. Okay, knowledge items. The applicant demonstrates understanding of route planning, including consideration of, I'm going to list all these first and then we'll discuss them. Available navigational facilities, special use airspace, preferred routes, primary and alternate airports, en route charts, chart supplements, NOTAMs, and terminal procedure publications. All right, let's jump into this, guys. Available navigational facilities. Now, these days, we basically have 2 different types of navigation types. 2 different types of navigation, okay? We have ground-based navigation and we have satellite-based navigation. So the facilities that they're discussing are typically going to be ground-based navigation. We're talking about VORs, we're talking about ILSs, we're talking about NDBs, things like that. NDBs you're not really going to find much anymore, but certainly VORs, ILSs, localizers, those are all very much prevalent today and still in use. As much as some of you out there might wish that they weren't, they still very much are. So we need to know what's available along our route. Specifically, if you are planning a flight using GPS, it's always best practice to have an idea, at the very least, of what VORs or airways, Victor Airways, you might be able to fall back on in case of GPS loss or failure. Aviation is all about redundancy, and so as much as possible, we always want to try to build in backups to everything we do. This includes navigation. It's so easy to get reliant upon GPS these days, but we have to remember it can so easily just go away one of these days, whether it be intentional or unintentional. We might not have GPS all the time. So we want to make sure that we are familiar with the Victor Airways that we could use along our route as an alternate and what those navigational facilities are, okay? This would pertain to not only the en route environment as far as the actual route you're flying from point A to point B, but this also includes the type of facilities available at the airport that you're flying to, your destination, so that you know what types of things might be available for approaches, like again, either a localizer ILS or VOR facility on the field or in the vicinity if it has a VOR approach. Okay, special use airspace, guys. Now, you know, the nice thing about IFR flying is that ATC is generally going to keep you clear of any special use airspace that you shouldn't be in. That is not to say, though, that you should just plan a flight that goes straight through special use airspace, because at the very least, it's probably going to mean that the routing you submit in your flight plan is going to be changed upon receiving your clearance, and that can make the actual act of receiving and copying your clearance a lot more difficult, because you're going to be they're going to be telling you possibly at times a clearance that is far different from what you filed, and that can make it hard to copy in real time as they're reading it back to you. So to make everyone's life easier, we want to be aware of special use airspaces and try to avoid it as much as possible when we are doing our flight planning. We talked more in detail about the special use airspace, I believe, back when we were doing the private pilot ACS breakdown, when we talked about the National Airspace System. So if you haven't heard that, go back and listen to that episode to know what types of special use airspace you might be looking for. All right, preferred routes. This one thing can make your flight planning super simple in most cases. So the FAA actually publishes routes and the types of aircraft that are flying those routes on their website that they are consistently clearing on a regular basis, whether it's been a certain number in the past few weeks or in the past month. They tell you how many times they've cleared a certain aircraft along this route between this airport and this airport, point A and B. They talk about the type of aircraft it is and the altitude it was cleared for. So it gives you a really good picture and a good idea of, if you're not sure kind of, should I take this route or should I file to this waypoint? What would ATC prefer? Well, we look at these routes, and for those of you watching on YouTube, we can actually use ForeFlight to look at this. All right, so we're going to pretend we're taking a flight from here at Hillsboro, which is Kilo Hotel India Oscar, down to Medford, which is Kilo Mike Foxtrot Romeo. So let's go and put this in here. Hotel India Oscar to Kilo Mike Foxtrot Romeo. All we have to do is put in our departure and our destination. From there, we can click on routes, and we see here that it actually says routes with a 10 in parentheses. That's telling us before we even click on it that there are 10 different routes that we could possibly take that other aircraft have already consistently been taking. All right, so we are in a piston aircraft. We are not a turboprop or anything like that. So we want to be looking for routes that have been cleared for piston aircraft at altitudes that are going to be attainable for our airplane. So we see here that we have one route going to the Eugene VOR and then OED. I'm not exactly sure what the OED VOR is, but that was at 4,000. That was cleared last Thursday, and it's been cleared 561 times total. That's what it tells us. That's for turboprop, piston, jet, and really it says anywhere from 6,000 up to flight level 360 is what it's kind of been cleared for. So that's certainly a route we could use. Every time we click on the route here in ForeFlight, it highlights it for us, so we get an idea of kind of how direct it is or if it's taken us too far out of our way. We could also, it says here that a lot of people are just flying this route direct. Okay, so we could just file direct in this case. Evidently, that's also been cleared over 500 times. So we're just going to pick the one that we like best. Let's go ahead and go with the first one. And that route, we can say select route. It's going to add it to our flight plan for us. And then we can change things like the altitude and things like that. And we can edit the route as we see fit. So those are preferred routes, and they are a great place to start anytime you're trying to plan an IFR flight. All right, primary and alternate airports. Now, primary airports, they're pretty straightforward. You want to go someplace, that's the airport you're going to go to, right? Now, there's always considerations in what airport you're going to, as far as does that particular airport have instrument procedures. For instance, our home airport here at Twin Oaks, we don't have any instrument procedures in and out of Twin Oaks. So oftentimes, if we're truly on an IFR day, we might not file to Twin Oaks. If we're doing some instrument training and we're coming home from wherever our destination is, we might not file to Twin Oaks. We might file to Hillsboro, because Hillsboro has a nice long runway, beautifully lit, brand new LED lighting, and a lot of different instrument approaches. So then from there, worst case scenario, we land at Hillsboro and we stay there overnight, which is only 7 miles away from home. It's not a big deal. But usually what we can do is get into Hillsboro with an instrument approach and then just hop over to Twin Oaks. So you want to think about that. You want to think, hey, does my ultimate destination have instrument procedures available? And if not, how am I going to deal with that? And then alternates. Well, alternate airports, as an example, if we were going to file to Twin Oaks coming from another airport, okay, we're trying to get home, we're going to file direct home. And actually, I just did this yesterday. I think it was yesterday. I did a wonderful flight with my student Wendy. Shout out to Wendy, where we were down at Eugene, and it was kind of IFR-y. I mean, it wasn't IFR. It was a VFR day, but it was definitely low visibility, and there were definitely lower clouds, so we were able to get some good IMC time, some actual time in there. So it was a VFR day to the point where it was certainly going to be to behoove us to file on our way home so that we didn't have to do a bunch of cloud dodging and things like that. But it was VFR enough, certainly at the airport at Twin Oaks, where we felt comfortable actually filing to Twin Oaks. So we filed from Eugene to Twin Oaks. And like I mentioned, Twin Oaks has no published instrument approaches or procedures. So anytime an airport does not have published instrument procedures, you must file an alternate for an airport that does. And of course, if you're planning to get into this airport like Twin Oaks, which has no published instrument procedures, you need to be able to descend from the MEA in visual conditions down to the airport. So you want to make sure that the weather on that given day is going to be good enough for you to do that. But regardless of what the weather is, if you are filing to a final destination to an airport that has no instrument procedures, you must file an alternate to an airport that does. So we filed from Eugene to Twin Oaks yesterday, and of course we put Hillsboro as our alternate. All right, now of course that's not the only time when an alternate is going to be required. Most people know, I should say, the 1, 2, 3 rule. And they'll say, yeah, you need an alternate if 1 hour before to 1 hour after your estimated time of arrival, the ceilings are less than 2,000 feet and the visibility is less than 3 miles. That's usually what people say. Now, is that what the regulation says? And the answer is no. That's not what the regulation says. So the better way to phrase it, and technically the way the regulation phrases this rule, okay, is you always need an alternate. Always. Unless from 1 hour before to 1 hour after your estimated time of arrival, the weather is forecast to be better than 2,000 feet ceilings and 3 miles of visibility. Okay? So it's a different way of looking at it. Technically, the first way I said it is correct, but you want to be looking at it as we always need an alternate unless the weather is going to be better than this minimum. Okay? And that's the way the regulation actually words it. Moving on to our next line item. En route charts. All right, guys. So en route charts, most of us, at least initially, are going to be using the low en route charts. That's airspace below 18,000 feet, right? Not Class A or Alpha airspace. So if we pull up our low en route chart here in ForeFlight, again, for those of you watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see this. And for those of you out there in podcast land, you guys can hopefully find the video later on. You can see this if you want, or just know what to be looking for. I'm going to go ahead and screen record this. All right, so low en route charts, the types of things that you want to know. The short answer is everything. Everything is what you want to know. But for instance, we've got things here like these altitudes along airways. In this case, let's find this one here. We've got one altitude, just number says 4,000, and below it we have a little star or little asterisk that says 3,400. So 4,000, that would be our MEA, our minimum en route altitude. 3,400 would be our MOCA, not to be confused with the coffee drink, but our MOCA, our minimum obstruction clearance altitude. So our MEA, of course, is the altitude at which you will be clear of any obstacles along that Victor airway. You will also be guaranteed signal reception from the VORs or the stations that are providing you the navigation along that airway. Okay, our minimum obstruction clearance altitude is the altitude at which you will stay clear of any obstacles or obstructions, but you're not going to necessarily be guaranteed signal reception until you're within 22 miles of the station. You are guaranteed it within 22 miles. All right, you want to know things like, if we look at the bottom here below the airway, we see the number 22. And then right to the right of it, we see the number 127 in a square box. So what that's saying is that the 22 is the leg between these two waypoints. In this case, we have Craft waypoint, and up here we have McCoy waypoint. 22 miles is the distance between those two waypoints on this leg of this Victor 287 airway. The 127 that you see in the square box is the total distance of this airway from the two stations that are used to create it. In this case, that would be the Newburgh VOR up here, all the way down to the North Bend VOR. 127 miles all the way from the Newburgh VOR to the North Bend VOR on Victor 287. So that's what that number inside the square box is indicating, okay? Other things you're going to want to know, for instance, you want to know the different types of VORs and how they're depicted. This one here we're looking at, Eugene, is a VORTAC. It's kind of got like the, I don't know what the official name of the shape is, but it's kind of got the triangle shape with the three black squares on the corners. So that's different for instance, the Corvallis VOR, which is your VOR DME. It's your hexagon with the square around it. Okay. Let's see. You want to know the difference between Victor Airways and Tango Airways. Victor Airways being ground-based navigation that are strung between two VORs. Okay. Tango Airways being GPS-based navigation, which you would need an appropriate GPS unit in order to fly. Okay. Tango Airways are very nice because they can go places that Victor Airways can't, and they often will allow you to fly lower than Victor Airway that might be equivalent to it, because with the GPS, you don't need to be high enough for signal reception of a ground-based nav aid. All right. So you want to know that the Tango Airways are the blue airways that we see, and the Victor Airways are the black ones. Of course, you want to know all these little flags. We got this flag with an X. That's a minimum crossing altitude. And then we can see what is listed as your minimum crossing altitudes up here. You want to know what the different colored airports are. Okay, guys, so we see a lot of green airports around here. What's the difference between a green airport and, let's say, a brown airport? We see a few brown airports down here. And then what's the difference between that and a blue airport like PDX? Okay, so just to give you a quick rundown, green airports are airports with instrument approach procedures. Okay, those are the ones that you kind of care about in this case. Brown airports are airports that don't have instrument approach procedures, but they do have runways in excess, at least one runway, with a length in excess of 3,000 feet, okay? Or at minimum 3,000 feet. And then the blue ones are kind of the weird ones. Not so much things you need to know about, but for instance, at PDX, it is blue. And that indicates that it has an approach procedure that comes in basically from a very high altitude. It's a high altitude approach procedure, and it's used for the military, not for GA flying or even the airlines necessarily, I don't believe. So if we look up PDX and we go to the approaches, you can see it says we have ILSs to all the runways, but then we also have this high ILS. So if we look at the high ILS or localizer 28 right, first of all, you see this little barber pole pattern across the top. That should tell you that this is not for you, okay? This is for military stuff generally. And you can see, actually, if we look at, not this one, let's look at not the 28 right high, but let's look at the 28 left high. You can see this 28 left high ILS starts at flight level 200, so 20,000 feet is where it starts from, okay? So that is what the blue airports on the low-end route charts indicate. All right. We could spend all day going over the low-end route charts, but that should give you a good starting point as to what you need to know. But again, you need to know what all these are. One last thing I'll mention is these big numbers that you'll see in the quadrants, the square quadrants, similar to our maximum elevation figures for our VFR charts. These are our OROCAs, our off-route obstruction clearance altitudes. Okay, so again, these are altitudes at which, if you fly them off route, off of any VOR, when you're not on an established airway, you will be clear of obstructions by at least 2,000 feet in mountainous terrain or areas and at least 1,000 feet in non-mountainous. Okay. All right, guys, let's keep going here. Otherwise, we'll be here all day. Chart supplements. So chart supplements, again, these days we've got our handy iPads, our electronic flight books, and our programs like ForeFlight, which provide you pretty much all the information you need. In the past, chart supplements were their own separate books, okay, that you had to carry with you. But nowadays, we just need to know basically how to access the chart supplement from ForeFlight. You can basically click on any airport, scroll down a bit, and find what ForeFlight still labels as AF/D, that's Airport Facility Directory, A/FD, Airport and Facility Directory, but it says chart supplement above it. So that'll pull up all the information for that particular airport in the chart supplement. And then you can also find the chart supplements in the document sections. If you pull up the document section on ForeFlight and go to the FAA folder, you can pull up the chart supplement folder, and it's got the chart supplements for all regions of the country in there. Okay, lots of great information in the chart supplements, guys, so you want to be familiar with those. Okay, guys, NOTAMs. NOTAMs, or notices to air missions, are notices put out for a variety of reasons. There's two kind of main types that we talk about. There's FDC NOTAMs and there's NOTAMDs. NOTAMDs being kind of just FYI, kind of just advisory. They will talk about things like taxiway closures or runway closures, things on the airport surface that you need to be aware of. whereas FDC NOTAMs are regulatory in nature. And that's what you need to remember. Put that term in your head. FDC NOTAMs are regulatory in nature, and specifically when it comes to instrument flying, we often see FDC NOTAMs in regards to any changes to instrument procedures like approaches or departures. Anytime certain minimums are changed on an instrument approach, or anytime a certain approach is no longer available, those would be FDC NOTAMs, okay? So those are definitely things we want to be paying attention to. And of course, NOTAMs are one of the many things that we are required as pilot in command to be familiar with before any flight. Okay, that's part of our 91-103 pre-flight actions, in which we can use our Northwest Craft acronym. Okay, and first thing in Northwest Craft, N for NOTAMs. So we want to be familiar with NOTAMs, make sure we get a good weather briefing and get all of those NOTAMs before our flight, being sure to check the NOTAMs for the specific airports, both your primary and alternate that you plan to go to, as well as the specific approaches that you might use at those airports to make sure there's no changes that could catch you off guard. All right. Terminal procedure publications. All right, guys, so terminal procedure publications, that's basically all of our approaches, arrivals, our departure procedures, and fortunately, again, we have all of these in ForeFlight for us these days. Now, we need to make sure that we can read and understand. So like on an approach plate, we need to make sure we know everything that's on that plate, or at the very least, where to find information on it. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this in this podcast. Again, I don't want to make this too long. If it would be helpful for you, if I went through like an approach plate, like step by step, every single thing on it, I might do that in another video. Let me know what you think about that, if it would be helpful. But for right now, I wanted to bring up one thing that not everybody knows about, and it's a very important document. It's called the Digital Terminal Procedure Supplemental. And this document you can also get in ForeFlight, and this talks about some very useful things like the types of approach lighting systems that there are. It talks about your in-op table and your in-op components. You need to know when a certain piece of equipment, like if your approach lighting system is not operative, what does that mean to you? Well, we can see here, and on this inoperative components table, it says that for an ILS or PAR, LPV, or GLS minima, if the inoperative component or visual aid is the approach lighting system, you need to increase your visibility for that approach minima by 1/4 mile. All right, so this in-op table is an important thing to be familiar with, and sometimes you'll see in the notes section of a specific procedure, it'll say in-op table does not apply. All right, so you need to be familiar with this in-op table. That's just one thing in this digital terminal procedures supplement. And another very valuable thing, along with abbreviations and definitions, is at the very end on the last page, it has your instrument takeoff or approach procedure rate of climb / descent table. So basically, this is your table that outlines for a given speed or a given climb gradient, let's say. If a certain departure procedure states that you need to be able to maintain at least 300 feet per nautical mile, this will let you easily see and calculate what 300 feet per nautical mile translates into 4 feet per minute at a certain ground speed. So very useful document here, and that's definitely one you're going to want to keep in your IFR folder in your document section on ForeFlight. All right, guys, our next one is altitude selection, accounting for terrain and obstacles, glide distance of airplane, IFR cruising altitudes, effective wind, and oxygen requirements. Lots to unpack here. And, again, I'm not going to be able to get it through all of this in this one podcast, but if there are specific things you'd like to have me expand upon, leave a comment below, shoot me a message, let me know what you want to hear more about. I'm happy to dive into any one of these things. But altitude selection, so our same rules apply as far as when we go basically west, we're going to choose an even altitude. When we go east, we're going to choose an odd altitude. The only difference from VFR flying is we're not adding 500 feet. Okay, we're flying even altitudes, being round altitudes of thousands of feet. Okay, but as far as how we choose, between 6,000 and 8,000 feet, well, number one, we need to make sure we're not going to hit anything. That's where our minimum en route altitudes come into play. When we're looking at that en route chart, we need to kind of look at the MEAs along the routes we're planning to fly and see what's the lowest that we're kind of able to fly. Then we need to balance that with the other side of things. Well, that's the lowest I can fly. What's the highest I'm able to fly? That's going to be determined by a lot of things, namely your airplane. How capable is your aircraft? What type of capability does it have? Is it turbocharged? Does it have icing protection? Okay, is it approved for flight and known icing? And if it's not, where is the freezing level at? Because if you get up high enough where you are beyond the freezing level and you're going to be in the clouds, well, that could cause some problems. So you are typically going to be limited, more so with IFR flying than VFR, as to not only how high you can fly, but how low you can fly even more, because there needs to be more buffer, more room for, more buffer on the low end. Like here in the Pacific Northwest, our MEAs are guaranteeing us 2,000 feet above terrain. So all of our MEAs are pretty high. You're not going to find an MEA around here usually much lower than 4,000. Okay, a couple here and there maybe on the coast, but for much of the flying that we do around here, our MEAs are 4,000 or above, and that's why this time during the winter, when it gets cold and the icing levels, the freezing levels drop, we can't always go flying IFR. So that's one thing to consider when choosing altitude. Of course, wind is always something you want to be aware of as well. You might have more favorable winds at one altitude versus the other. This is true for VFR flying as well. And then oxygen requirements. Same things we talked about with private. Of course, if you are going to be up higher than 12,500 feet, specifically for over a half hour, you will need supplemental oxygen. Even if you're not there for over a half hour, it might be a good idea to have some supplemental oxygen. And certainly if you get up even higher than that and into the flight levels, you're either going to need to be in a pressurized airplane or have that supplemental oxygen available. All right, calculating, and that's what's one category of calculating. And here it goes on to talk about all the things that you're going to be calculating, which are time, climb and descent rates, course, distance, heading, true airspeed, ground speed. This is all stuff we learned how to do in our private, right, with our nav log. None of that changes, okay? The only thing that changes is that instead of doing the nav log based off of visual waypoints with pilotage and dead reckoning, we are now basically creating this nav log along airways, okay, from one VOR to the next and so on and so forth. The next thing you're calculating is estimated time of arrival, including conversion to universal coordinated time, or UTC time. All right. Remember, UTC time is a constant and a standard. So, being, we just had daylight savings time end recently here in November for these 4 months. If you don't live in a place that has daylight savings time, then lucky you, your difference, your UTC plus or minus doesn't change throughout the year. But for most of us who observe daylight savings time, Remember, the difference between your local time and UTC is going to change by an hour throughout the year with daylight savings time versus standard time. All right, so make sure you know that. As far as calculating ETAs and things like that, fortunately, ForeFlight will help you with that, but you still need to be able to do it just like we did before with our VFR flying, using proper wind calculations, ground speed calculations, and time en route and all that. Fuel requirements, including reserve. So let's talk about this for a second, guys. Fuel requirements. We know, or should know, that for IFR flying, unlike for VFR flying, our fuel reserves are a little differently. So our fuel reserves, I should say, are a little different. For IFR flying, we need to have enough fuel to get to our initial destination. Then we need to have enough fuel to get to our filed alternate and still have 45 minutes worth of fuel after that at normal cruise settings. Now, that's the legal definition. The thing that we need to also consider, though, especially in the IFR environment, is that we don't just get to an airport and land like we do when we're VFR, right? We have to fly an approach. Sometimes we have holds and delays built in. So not only are you going to have your fuel to get to your destination and then to your alternate plus 45 minutes, I like to add, as a rule of thumb, 15 minutes worth of fuel for every approach that I plan to fly or that I want to be able to fly. So if you get to your destination, you're going to obviously do an approach. I'm going to plan for 15 minutes extra for that approach. What if we go missed? Well, if I go miss there and I want to be able to possibly try that approach again before going to my alternate, I'm going to add in another 15 minutes worth of fuel for that approach. And then, assuming I might have to go to my alternate and fly an approach there, I'm going to have another 15 minutes for that approach over there. So just with those 3 approaches that I want to be able to fly if need be, that's already an extra 45 minutes of fuel that I'm accounting for. Okay, so that would be, for me, enough fuel to get to my destination, enough fuel then to go to my alternate, enough fuel to have 45 minutes more of flight time at normal cruise, and then I'm going to add another 45 minutes on top of that for the 3 approaches that I plan to fly. Okay, so that is something to consider when we are talking about our fuel requirements and fuel reserves in the IFR world. All right, and then finally here, procedures for activating and closing an IFR flight plan in controlled and uncontrolled airspace. So it's pretty easy, guys. If you land at a towered airport, your flight plan is automatically closed for you by the tower, and that's very nice that they do that. However, if you land at an uncontrolled airport, it is up to you to make sure that flight plan gets closed. Now, if you are VMC before you land, you can do that with ATC over the radio before you actually land, cancel in the air. If you're not able to cancel in the air, you can sometimes contact them on the ground over the radio. But depending on how far away from civilization you are at this particular airport, you might have to pull the phone out. And you might either have to call ATC directly and cancel the flight plan over the phone, or you might have to call flight service and have them close out your flight plan for you. Okay, so those are kind of your options there when it comes to closing an IFR flight plan. All right, guys, let's move on to risk management. Okay, guys, risk management. I'm going to read the first 4 items in this section. I want you to tell me if they sound familiar. We've got pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. Do those 4 things sound familiar? Well, those are our 4 items in our PAVE acronym. And I've done a whole episode, podcast episode already on the PAVE acronym, so I'm not going to get too much into this here today, but I will go over a couple key points. And if you go listen to my other episode on the PAVE acronym, you're going to see that I talk about the PAVE acronym as being the acronym to rule all other acronyms because we can basically use the PAVE acronym not just for risk management, but as a model or as a structure for kind of talking about every single thing almost that your examiner is going to want to hear about on your check ride, particularly in the oral portion. So when we're talking about the pilot, we're talking about the legality of the pilot. Okay, that would be currency. We're talking about the safety of the pilot. That'd be proficiency. We're talking about, back to legality also, the required documents that a pilot needs to have on them, of course. Logbook, pilot certificate, all that. And we're talking about personal minimums of the pilot. Looking forward to our aircraft, we can use our AV8's acronym for our required inspections, our AERO acronym for our required documents, and things like A tomato flames for required equipment. Also, of course, just knowing that we are proficient in that aircraft, that we are comfortable with the avionics, and knowing the risks associated with flying unfamiliar aircraft as well. Of course, making sure we do a thorough pre-flight and knowing how to handle any inoperative equipment as well. Moving on to environment. Environment covers a lot of different things, but basically I like to use just the Northwest Craft acronym. That's part 91103, required pre-flight actions, and that covers most everything that you would find as an environmental risk. All right, so Northwest Craft. Finally, external pressures. We don't really have an acronym to go with external pressures. Maybe if you have one, leave a comment down below, let me know. But the big thing to remember when it comes to external pressures is that we, as pilots and our passengers, never need to be anywhere in aviation. And we need to always have a plan B that we can back our plans up with, okay? If it's a day trip, a short trip that is easy enough to drive last minute, and you look outside that morning and the weather's not great, then you just make the decision to drive and it's no big deal. If it's a further trip you're trying to take and you know it's someplace you need to be, like a wedding or anniversary or birthday party or whatever, you want to plan ahead, buy an airline ticket, make sure it's a refundable ticket. The day comes, the weather looks great, you can fly yourself, perfect. Call up, cancel your airline ticket, you'll get a credit for next time. And of course, if the weather isn't good, there's no pressure to fly yourself. You'll easily make it, and you just take that airline ticket that you purchased. So that's our PAVE acronym in a nutshell. And again, full episode available here on the podcast on that. We're going to dive in a little bit more into the next two sections. Our next one being limitations of air traffic control services. Now, before I get into this, do you guys know that there's actually a full FAA published handbook called the Risk Management Handbook? It's not something that most pilots know about, not something that enough pilots read, but just like we have the Airplane Flying Handbook and the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, we have a Risk Management Handbook as well, along with your Instrument Flying Handbooks and all those things, okay? So you can download the free version, the PDF of the Risk Management Handbook, either straight from the FAA website or on ForeFlight, okay? And what I wanted to talk about when it comes to limitations of air traffic control services, there's a couple things we always want to just keep in mind. Number one, ATC's technology can be limited. Specifically, let's talk about radar. Radar coverage can be limited in certain areas consistently, or radar services can be lost, right? So obviously, that will limit the amount of services that ATC can offer you if they can't make radar contact with you. But also, certain procedures, certain instrument approach procedures, for instance, are not authorized to be flown without radar. So that's something to be aware of. Other things we need to be aware of are, this is a big misconception, especially among VFR-only pilots, and that is that ATC cannot see clouds. Their radar picks up returns on precipitation, But that doesn't mean they know where the clouds are. They have no idea where the clouds are. That's why it's important that we as the pilots give them reports like bases of clouds and tops of clouds. But if you're out there flying expecting ATC to be able to vector you to an area where there's no clouds or tell you exactly where the clouds are, that's not going to happen. So we need to make sure that we're looking to other sources for that type of information and using our risk management skills to plan appropriately. Other things to be aware of is that ATC are not generally pilots. They don't know everything that you know about flying that airplane. There may be certain procedures, certain approach procedures or other things that you are either not capable of doing or are not legally allowed to do, and they won't necessarily know that stuff. So it's important for you in your pre-flight planning to really be doing a thorough briefing and understanding everything from what approaches you're going to be able to fly, what approaches you're not going to be able to fly, and if necessary, what requirements will you need to be able to meet in order to fly a certain procedure, okay? So just remember, they are not pilots. They don't know everything you know. And lastly, the thing to keep in mind about ATC is that ATC are people too. They're just human beings. They make mistakes. So when it comes to situational awareness, it's important that we don't just 100% ever rely on ATC to hold our hands or to give us 100% accurate information. We need to be aware of the terrain around us, of the minimum altitudes for the courses we're flying, of the OROCAs, right? The off-route obstruction clearance altitudes, and anything else that can pose a hazard to us, because it does happen, just like pilots make mistakes, where an air traffic controller could make a mistake, give you a wrong altitude, give you a wrong heading, completely forget about you for a period of time. So we always need to have the situational awareness to kind of know what's going on and be responsible for our own safety at all times. A friend of mine, Dimitri, actually made a video on this subject not too long ago. I'm going to put the card up here for those of you watching on YouTube. I'll try to put the link in the comments. And he actually received an instruction from ATC to descend to a inappropriate altitude. And he was aware enough to know that that didn't quite sound right. And I think he was about to question ATC when they actually realized their own mistake and gave him the correct altitude. But those are the types of things we want to be aware of. Don't just take things at face value. If something seems off, ask ATC. Question them, not questioning their authority, but question them, if nothing else, to make sure that you are sure that you heard them correctly. Okay? So, limitations of air traffic control services, very important to be aware of when it comes to risk management. Now, next line item, limitations of electronic planning applications and programs. Well, I'm looking at ForeFlight here. What's one of the biggest limitations of ForeFlight, or more specifically, the iPad that I'm using it on? Well, some of you might say that it's the battery life, right? These things don't last forever. And if it dies at the wrong time and you have no other backups for all your charts, all your approach plates, you might find yourself in a situation that's a little uncomfortable. And it's not just that the battery could die, right? These things overheat. So anytime we're using electronic planning applications or programs or any electronic device, we need to make sure we have backups built in, okay? Whether it's just your cell phone, a second iPad, or even better, paper backups for anything you're planning to fly, whether it's a chart, whether it's an approach plate, anything like that, okay? And of course, we always want to be fully comfortable with the electronic navigation systems we have in the actual airplane. Those are a lot less likely to die and go away, so we want to make sure we're comfortable with those and we don't over-rely. Some people train so much with ForeFlight and seeing their little plane on the moving map, they begin to over-rely on ForeFlight. And when it goes away, again, they kind of get disoriented, even though all that same information should be right in front of them in their onboard GPS or on their instruments. So those are things we want to be aware of. Okay, fuel planning is the last item in our risk management. We kind of already talked about this. Okay, fuel planning is not only different legally than it is when we're talking about VFR flying. Okay, we need to have enough to go to our primary destination and then to our alternate and still have 45 minutes of fuel at normal cruising configuration. But we talked about I add 15 minutes of fuel for every approach I want to be able to fly. That doesn't mean I'm going to plan to fly those approaches necessarily. I might be going from point A to point B. I expect and I plan to fly one approach into the airport and be done. But if I want to have the option to fly that approach again, or of course, maybe have 2 opportunities to fly the approach at my alternate, I'm going to plan for all those approaches and add on 15 minutes for each one. So that's fuel planning. Okay. Lastly, guys, looking at the skills section. In our skills section, that says the applicant exhibits the skill to prepare, present, and explain a cross-country flight plan assigned by the evaluator, including a risk analysis based on real-time weather, which includes calculating time en route, fuel considering factors such as power settings, operating altitude, wind, fuel reserve requirements, and weight and balance requirements. So basically everything we just talked about, you just need to be able to speak to it in whatever scenario the examiner poses to you. Okay, next we have recalculate fuel reserves based on a scenario provided by the evaluator. So they might give you a scenario where you have to divert to a different airport than you had planned on, and you need to be able to recalculate what fuel reserves you will have or you do have and whether or not that will be a viable alternate or diversion. Something along those lines. You need to be able to create a navigation plan and simulate filing an IFR flight plan. Okay. You need to be able to interpret departure, arrival, en route, and approach procedures with reference to appropriate and current charts. Another limitation of these electronic flight books and applications. If you are not connected to internet, it is very possible that the information you are seeing in ForeFlight or whatever other program you use is not up to date, is not current. And it may or may not actually tell you that it's not current. Usually it'll tell you if the approach plates that you have are expired, okay? But when it comes to real critical things like weather, you need to actually kind of look, because it won't just say, hey, this weather information is expired. Sometimes it will, but sometimes it won't, depending on how you're looking at it. You need to make sure you're connected to the internet, that it has an internet connection, and that you are looking at real-time information, or at least the most up-to-date information available. And certainly when it comes to your approach plates and charts, you need to make sure that you are updating those and keeping them updated prior to getting out to the plane for your flight. It doesn't really make a difference if you have cellular services built into your iPad or not, because if you wait till you're already in the plane flying around, you very well may not get enough signal in the plane in order to be able to download those updated charts. So make sure we keep current charts in our EFBs. Next, we have recognize simulated wing contamination due to airframe icing and demonstrate knowledge of the adverse effects of airframe icing during pre-takeoff, takeoff, cruise, and landing phases of flight, as well as the corrective actions. Now, we talked about icing a little bit in our weather episode that came last week. And basically, you're going to want to know the effects that ice has on your plane. Can you take off with just frost? If you have frost on the plane on a cool winter morning, here in the Pacific Northwest, it's not actually the rainy days that we have to worry about so much. It's the bright sunny days that tend to be really cold. That you'll wake up in the morning and have a nice layer of frost all across your airplane. Can you take off with that? I think we all know the answer to that. Okay, any amount of ice, whether it's frost or otherwise, will impair the wing's ability to create lift and will add weight to the aircraft in the process, okay? Losing lift and adding weight are two very bad things, okay? All right, so you want to be able to speak to that, the different types of ice and how it would affect each phase of flight. What things would you do to mitigate the situation or get out of it if you were to find yourself in it, okay? And it all starts, by the way, with proper flight planning, okay? All right, finally, we have apply pertinent information from appropriate and current aeronautical charts, chart supplements, notices to air missions relative to the airport, runway and taxiway closures, and other flight publications. So basically, this is being able to read your charts, read your NOTAMs, read your approach plates, interpret the information, and apply it, okay? This is it's kind of just the stuff you do every day in every flight, and certainly if you're not proficient with it, then you're probably not ready for your check ride. But it's a kind of a general topic that spans a large breadth of information and skill. All right, so guys, that is the cross-country portion of our instrument pilot oral ACS breakdown. All right, I hope you guys got a lot out of that. Please leave any comments down below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps out the channel. I'm trying to really get the word out and grow this channel and grow this podcast. So if you know anybody else who you think would benefit from this information, please share this information with them. I really appreciate you spending time with me today, and we will see you next time on Centerline.